Let me just start off by saying it was my experience as a child in a Seventh-day Adventist church in rural Wisconsin that probably predestined me in some ways to become a church musician. For some reason, my parents always parked me on the front pew next to the church organist, who would feed me lime lifesavers throughout the service when she wasn't actually at the organ bench. And so I just had this, positive reinforcement that I just can't shake it. Okay, but I've been playing the organ in a paid position of one sort or another since I was 16, so that's almost 60 years now. Um, let me just say also that I'm just very pleased to be with you all, and Lauren has been a big blessing to me, even as he has said good things about what Levon and I were able to be to him during his college years. And so I'm just really thrilled to be part of your discussion today. My title today is What Language Shall I Borrow? That's a line from verse 3 of the classic Holy Week hymn, O Sacred Head Now Wounded. And the full sentence is, What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? And I'd like to just play a video clip of that for you, and then we'll get into some of the content that I've got prepared. That was a cathedral choir from Australia. What language shall I borrow? Now, the poet who crafted that question was James W. Alexander, a professor at Princeton Seminary, who translated the German precursor hymn into English in 1829. But in the face of Christ's sufferings for sinful and lost humans, Alexander just felt incapable of coming up with language to describe his deep gratitude. Thus, he wants to borrow some language. And that phrase, what language shall I borrow, captures the sense of speechlessness that I think many of us experience when confronted with the divine mystery. When we experience life's greatest joys or greatest sorrows, and when we sense the divine presence, whether in church or in the natural world, or in our relationships, we can be at a loss for words. Both music and verse come to our aid in these moments, and the church's hymns, I think, can be a wonderful resource. The need to borrow language comes when we encounter something so extreme and so unexpected that we don't have ready language for it. This puts the amazing in John Newton's Amazing Grace. And so Newton borrows language from Romans, where Paul exclaims, wretched man that I am, and writes, that saved such a wretch as me, and from John's tale of the man born blind from birth. I once was blind, but now I see. This encounter with the amazing is an important dimension of the very nature of religion, as Rudolf Otto intimated in talking about the mysterium tremendum and the holy other and the numinous. This hymn, O Sacred Head as we know it, is a translation of a translation. Paul Gerhardt was a German Lutheran pastor, and in 1656 he published O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden, O Head full of blood and wounds. But his hymn is a translation from the Latin hymn of Arnulf of Louvain, who died in 1250. Arnulf's hymn was entitled Membra Jesu Nostri Patientis Sanctissima, the most holy limbs of our suffering Jesus. It was a meditation on the various body parts of the crucified Jesus, beginning with the contemplation of the feet and working up through the legs and the chest to the face and the wounds on Christ's head. So this hymn is really the work of three poets, each one borrowing something from the previous one, and each elaborating to reflect his own encounter with the crucified Christ, with this stunning gift of divine love. And James Alexander in 1829 is so moved that after translating Gerhardt's translation of Arnulf, he's still looking for words. And though neither Gerhardt nor Arnulf said it, he exclaims, "What language shall I borrow? What language could be adequate to name this dying love?" Well, this makes me want to open my hymnal to the anonymous 1811 hymn, What Wondrous Love Is This? Emerging in a very different time and place. It emerged from the camp meetings and revivals of the Second Great Awakening in the American South. What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that caused the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, to bear the dreadful curse for my soul. Now those words from 1811 are deeply embedded in my consciousness, as are James Alexander's words from 1829 and the words of so many other hymn writers. As someone who has worked with hymns both as a pastor and as a worship leader, as a musician, and as a spiritual friend, I find that certain hymns are likewise embedded in the souls of my fellow Christians. Recently, I was practicing the organ for the next Sunday's service. And after I had played When Peace Like a River, also known as It Is Well With My Soul, one of the women who was there to set up things for the next day told me that when she had been ordained to the diaconate, she had insisted on that hymn. She insisted on that hymn as part of that service. Those who were doing the ordination at the cathedral tried to talk her out of it, but she insisted and she got her way. And so that hymn means much to her, not just because of what it meant in the first place, but because it symbolizes for her that her call to ordained ministry was affirmed by the church. She had worked for, her fellow human beings for a long time, both as an army chaplain's wife and in ministry to underpaid and the often abused workers on ships that come into the port here in Baltimore. But she felt called to ordain ministry, and that became the soundtrack of that affirmation of her call. A few minutes later, I was practicing a different hymn, Almighty Father, Strong to Save, the Navy hymn, as we know it. And another woman came up to me who was helping to get things ready for the service, and she said, "Thank you for choosing that. Because of a life-threatening illness that a friend of hers had just gone through, she had decided to put together her own funeral plans and file them with the church office. And that hymn, Almighty Father, Strong to Save, was one of the pieces of music she had chosen for her funeral, as a way of saying to those who had gathered to remember her that this hymn said something about her and about her trust in God." Little stories like these remind us that hymns help to form us as Christians. And I suppose that can be both good and bad depending on the content of the hymns. But for the moment, let's stick with the good stuff. I'd like to turn back the clock to some of the great hymn writers. The real father of Protestant hymnody was Martin Luther. Luther loved music, and he was scandalized by the way the church of his time had de facto restricted singing in worship to priests and trained choirs. Luther understood that public worship was both expressive and formative. Both expressive and formative. That is, our forms of worship shape us, they form us. If every day and every week we pray, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us," we are more likely to become forgiving people. And our forms of worship allow us to express ourselves in prayer and song. And to those ends, Luther argued for maximizing the participation of the worshipers. In 1524, he wrote a preface to a new hymnal. It was the first Lutheran hymnal published there in Wittenberg. And in that preface, he explained the formative purpose of hymns. St. Paul, he said, exhorted the Colossians, quote, "to sing spiritual songs and psalms heartily unto the Lord, so that God's word and Christian teaching might be instilled and implanted in many ways." Public worship in general, and hymns in particular, were designed to form, to shape good Christians. Now, Luther loved music, and he believed, and I'm quoting him here, that next to the Word of God, music deserves the highest praise. He also described music as the greatest gift of God. Luther charted out a different path from his fellow reformers. Like Luther, John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli thought people should sing in worship. But Luther was open to any and all music that didn't go against God's word. He did worry a little bit about the bawdy music that the young folk were singing. That's a familiar story in every age. But Calvin and Zwingli tried to restrict the congregation's singing to paraphrases of the biblical Psalms. But as a result, it was Lutheranism that really took off and developed artistically and musically far beyond those other traditions. Just one more note about Luther. In 1542, he wrote a preface to a new collection of burial hymns. In it, he outlined his beliefs about the way the burial service should be reformed. He criticized the overtones of fear and dread that permeated the music at the Catholic funerals of his age. And he encouraged the use of songs that radiated hope and proclaimed the glorious future of the resurrection of the dead. And I think as Adventists, that hope of the resurrection is central to who Adventists are. What language shall I borrow? Calvin and Zwingli played it safe, borrowing only the language of the Psalms. But Luther was willing to borrow whatever helped to proclaim the gospel, the good news. Thus he wrote at least 37 hymns of his own. "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" being the most famous and the most enduring. That hymn is based on Psalm 46, which reads, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." But that hymn is a creative adaptation. It's not a simple paraphrase of Psalm 46. It speaks to courage and hope for the people in Luther's pastoral care, people who, like Luther at that time, faced persecution for their beliefs. And so he said, "Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever." What language shall I borrow? Luther widely embraced creative adaptation of Scripture. English language hymnody, on the other hand, was stuck. It was influenced by by Calvin and Zwingli, and as a result, the churches in England for the next 2 centuries hewed to the Genevan ideal of singing paraphrases of Psalms. And the Psalters the rhyming metrical paraphrases of the Book of Psalms that were used in England were just really dull, and they were verbally clumsy. But 2 centuries after Luther posted his 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg, if that's indeed what happened on that date, his name, the name of the young man who emerged 2 centuries later was Isaac Watts. He was the son of a preacher man, but who was not clergy in the official Church of England, and who actually went to prison at least twice for his beliefs. Watts's father was part of what were called at the time non-conforming churches. The young Watts, however, was extremely open in his attitudes, very experimental, very ecumenical, unlike others in the separatist, non-conforming Congregationalist churches. What language shall I borrow? Watts agreed with the idea of basing Christian song on the Psalms, but he believed they needed to be reframed in New Testament terms. Here is Watts's own explanation. Where the psalmist describes religion by the fear of God, I have often joined faith and love to it. Where he speaks of pardon of sin through the mercies of God, I have added the merits of the Savior. Where he talks of sacrificing goats and bullocks, I rather mention the sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb of God. When he attends the ark with shouting in Zion, I sing of the ascension of my Savior into heaven, or his presence in his church on earth. Where the psalmist promises abundance of wealth, honor, and long life, I have changed some of these typical blessings for grace, glory, and life eternal, which are brought to light in the gospel and promised in the New Testament. Watts titled his crowning collection of hymns, "The Psalms of David Imitated in the Language of the New Testament and Applied to the Christian State and Worship." So you see what's going on in Isaac Watts. His creative adaptations of the Psalms then extended to other passages of Scripture. Galatians 4:16, for example, gave us one of the wonderful hymns that is still with us today, "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." And that, by the way, it turns out, is the most published hymn in American hymnals over the past 2 centuries. Watts gave us that wonderful hymn. He gave us Joy to the World. He gave us O God, Our Help in Ages Past. He gave us Come Ye That Love the Lord, and Let Your Joys Be Known. We're also known as We're Marching to Zion. He gave us My Shepherd Will Supply My Need. He gave us I Sing the Mighty Power of God, and so on. And just as a side note, if you want to hear a wonderful rendition of Our Marching to Zion, look online for Garrison Keillor's farewell broadcast of A Prairie Home Companion, the very last Prairie Home Companion broadcast, where he gets his audience singing We're Marching to Zion with incredible gusto. Also, please note, Watts's When I Survey the Wondrous Cross is very much like O Sacred Head, the hymn we began with, as a personal response to the crucifixion. It's not a description of the crucifixion or a theology of the cross. In that way, it's also very much like the African American spiritual, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord? And those three all contrast with the popular contemporary hymn In Christ Alone by Keith Getty and Stuart Townend. Getty and Townend are so driven by Calvinist theology that they wrote this line, "Till on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied." Now, the New Testament never associates the cross with the wrath of God. In the New Testament, the cross is always a sign of God's love. The only one in the Gospels who talks about the wrath to come is John the Baptist, not Jesus. And, I'm sorry, I just can't use that hymn. Thank you, Lauren, for posting that. I hope everybody has fun with that. Another sidelight before we move on. Despite the many good hymns that Isaac Watts wrote, he had some things that should have ended up on the cutting room floor and actually did. His most unfortunate opening line for a hymn was, "Blessed is the man whose bowels move." Now, that I have to read the rest of that verse. Blessed is the man whose bowels move and melt with pity to the poor, whose soul by sympathizing love feels what his fellow saints endure. A wonderful sentiment, but I'm glad that we don't try to sing that hymn anymore. This week, Lauren found for me, however, several examples online where people actually did have some fun singing, "Blessed is the man whose bowels move."
But the Lord has bowels too, according to the...
Exactly. Bowels of mercy. The next major influence on the English language hymnody, though, was Charles Wesley. So we're moving from Isaac Watts to Charles Wesley in our brief historical survey here. He was the brother of John Wesley and the co-founder of the Methodist movement. Charles Wesley was like Luther in wanting hymns that people would sing. Because he and John focused their ministry on working class people, particularly on coal miners out in the fields. He was careful to write hymns that illiterate, unschooled, working class people not only could sing, but would want to sing. Charles was highly trained in music, and he hosted chamber concerts in his home. But in his ministry, it was all about the working folk. His genius was his ability to structure hymns so that they would essentially walk the singer through the steps of conversion and sanctification. Now, that was a very Methodist thing to do, to try to put the steps of conversion and sanctification in some particular order, but that was the early Methodist approach. He wrote hymns of Christian experience while also being influenced by sophisticated theology that he borrowed from the Eastern Orthodoxy. He was very fond of the 4th century bishop and poet Eusebius of Caesarea, and on some other occasion I might point out some of those Eastern Orthodox influences in his hymn, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." But now we're going to move rapidly into American hymnody, which was largely a blending of various streams brought by European immigrants. So the psalm paraphrases did come across with the Dutch Calvinists. The Methodists inspired revivalism, and revival inspired camp meeting songs. And those songs differed from European hymns in several ways. But the very first thing I would note about the difference is classic hymns were strophic, technical term meaning that they consisted of a series of verses that were all built around the same rhyme scheme. But the camp meeting and revival songs added the idea of a repeated chorus after each verse. So you can think of any number of songs that have verses and choruses, and that made them easier for use with the unchurched and illiterate crowds at those camp meetings. If you didn't get the verses, at least you could chime in on the chorus. I want to then turn attention to the African American contribution. There was a lot of interplay between the African American tradition and the music of the camp meetings. And one such song birthed out of that blended context is the Gospel Plow, also known as "Keep Your Hand on the Plow, Hold On." Scholarly research has it that this was a white spiritual that infiltrated into the African American church. I'm not so sure about that because it's somewhat shrouded in the hazes of history. But in any case, African Americans took that song and generations later swapped out the "Keep Your Hand on the Plow" line and turned it into "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize," which became one of the most important freedom songs of the civil rights movement. Let me just play a clip for you of that. And of course, the background to this is the passage in Matthew where Jesus says, "He who puts his hand to the plow and turns back is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven." So the song is about keeping your hand on the plow and your eyes on where you're going. I'm hoping that the balance between voice and piano in this one works out for you. Well, there are two more verses we could have listened to, but I'm tired of listening to my own voice there. The African American musical tradition interacted with white Christianity at the camp meetings of the 1800s, but there was a brilliant moment in 1871 when a touring choir of black singers from what is now Fisk University in Nashville crossed paths with the great revivalist Dwight L. Moody and his song leader Ira Sankey. The Fisk Jubilee Singers were on concert tour trying to raise money to keep Fisk afloat financially. But when they heard of how Moody's church was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire, even though Fisk University was on the verge of financial collapse at the time, the Jubilee Singers dedicated their offering to rebuilding Moody's church. On their North American tour, the Jubilee Singers discovered that white Northern Christians loved the slave songs, loved the spirituals that they included in their repertoire. And by 1873, 2 years later, they were touring England, singing for Queen Victoria, meeting with Prime Minister William Gladstone. Moody and Sankey were also traveling in England and holding evangelistic meetings at the same time. Moody invited the Jubilee Singers to take the stage, and one night even abandoned the prepared sermon he had to let the Fisk Singers sing a full program. This interface with Moody and Sankey gave African American gospel music and spirituals a wide open door into white churches. One of my favorite African American hymn writers is Charles Tindley, a freeborn black from Maryland. His father was enslaved, but his mother was free. He migrated to Philadelphia. Charles Tindley was completely self-taught. As a child, he taught himself to read from scraps of newspaper. And when he moved to Philadelphia, he took a job as a janitor in a Methodist church and soon aspired to the ministry himself. So to learn Hebrew, he went to a local synagogue. To learn New Testament Greek, he arranged for a correspondence lesson from Boston University. Without any degree, without any formal schooling, he was able to pass his Methodist ordination exams. He became the pastor of a church where he had been the janitor, and under his care that church grew to 7,000 members. Charles Tindley wrote many hymns, one of which was "I'll Overcome Someday," which in turn became the inspiration for the freedom song, "We Shall Overcome." He also wrote a song called "Stand By Me," which begins, "When the storms of life are raging, stand by me," a prayer for God to strengthen him in life's trials, just as Jesus, walking on water, reached out to pull sinking Peter from the waves. In our discussion, I hope we'll get a bit more personal about our favorite hymns and key lines from poetry, but I'll offer right here that I can't sing the last line of Tindley's "Stand By Me" without choking up with some emotion. The verse is about aging. Tindley wrote, "When I'm growing old and feeble, stand by me. When I'm growing old and feeble, stand by me. When my life becomes a burden, and I'm nearing chilly Jordan, O thou lily of the valley, stand by me." And now that I'm 75, I'm borrowing that language. I'd like to play my recording from 11 years ago, if I might, when I wasn't quite yet to an age where that verse meant as much to me as it does today. Again, this is 11 years ago, and it's recorded with a simple iPhone, and so the voice may be a little faint, but I hope you can pick up on those words.
When I'm growing old and feeble, stand by me. When my life becomes a burden, and I'm nearing chilly Jordan, oh, thou lily of the valley, stand by me.
Well, I've given you a broad brush approach to the ways that we as individuals and as churches borrow language, but I want to point out that movements also borrow language. Usually, or often, just making minor changes in the way language is adapted to the new purposes of the songs. I'd like to start by just talking about the labor movement very briefly. The labor movement took the African American spiritual, I shall not be moved, and turned it into we shall not be moved. I don't know if you know it. It's I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the water. I shall not be moved. The labor unions took that and changed it to we shall not be moved. And instead of a verse like Jesus is our captain, we shall not be moved, the union members would sing, the union is behind us, we shall not be moved. It's a wonderful case of language borrowing for a noble goal. And there are way too many examples to mention of religious songs adapted by the civil rights movement. I've already mentioned Charles Tindley's I'll Overcome Someday being adapted into We Shall Overcome. And I've mentioned how Keep Your Hand on the Plow becomes Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. That adaptation is usually credited to Alice Wine of Johns Island, South Carolina. I woke up this morning with my mind and it was stayed on Jesus. Became I woke up this morning and my mind was stayed on freedom, with minimal changes in the lyrics. Mostly just substituting freedom for Jesus. I don't know who did it for sure, but I think it may have been Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a wonderful activist in Mississippi. I'm going to just play a little bit of Fannie Lou Hamer leading a group of activists and singing, I woke up this morning with my mind and it was stayed on freedom.
Woke up this morning with my mind stay on freedom. Oh, I woke up this morning with my mind stay on freedom. Oh, I woke up this morning with my mind stay on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Oh, walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind. Stay on freedom. Hallelujah. 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 Singing and praying.
Well, that gives you a taste of what Fannie Lou Hamer was like as a leader. And one of the things you notice about that song is before each verse, she just gives a phrase that clues them into the next verse. There are a number of African American spirituals that change just one phrase from verse to verse, and this is an example. And that was, again, the genius of being able to produce music that people didn't need a songbook for. They didn't need to hold a hymnal. They could just join in with a simple cue. I mentioned earlier, were you there when they crucified my Lord? That's another example of one of those spirituals where you change one phrase, and then if you know the song, you know what every particular verse is going to be from there on. And there are a number of those in the African American tradition. Just a couple of other ones to mention that were adapted for the civil rights movement. I'm going to eat at the welcome table. That got a secular verse added. I'm going to be a registered voter. Don't you let nobody turn you around, which originally had the response line, keep on marching on to Galilee. became Keep On a Marching, Marching On to Freedom Land. I've got a wonderful recording in my CD collection of Mavis Staples singing that. I already mentioned We Shall Not Be Moved in the labor movement, but that was also adapted by the civil rights movement a couple of decades later. Go Tell It on the Mountain, This Little Light of Mine, Wade in the Water, Let My People Go. All of those were adapted from religious contexts for the, I think, deeply religious but also secular civil rights movement. Now, I'd like to turn to some problematic hymns. And for me, I think outdated language can hamper the usefulness of some hymns. Now, in Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, the original talks about, Here I raise my Ebenezer, and my guess is that most of us couldn't quite explain that line, and I won't try to at this point, but it has to do with the prophet Samuel setting up a stone of remembrance. But a bigger barrier, I think, is gender-exclusive language. And I realize people have different sensibilities on this issue. But I think most of us today would cringe a bit at having to sing, Rise Up, O Men of God. Or Faith of Our Fathers. And even our national hymn, God of Our Fathers, feels a bit awkward to me. Now, these hymns have been reworked so that we can sing them, but sometimes it's more successful than other times. Rise Up, O Saints of God is the standard reworking of Rise Up, O Men of God, and I think that works just fine. Faith of Our Fathers has become Faith of the Martyrs, and I don't think that works quite as well, since fathers implies a heritage and a relationship, as if to say, this is my daddy's faith, this is my grandfather's faith. That carries a relational power that singing about the martyrs doesn't quite carry. God of Our Fathers, I made a stab at revising that a couple of years ago, and my choir sang God our Creator, right after all those wonderful trumpet fanfares at the beginning, since the rest of the first stanza was about God's power in the universe. You might remember, God of Our Fathers, or God our Creator, whose almighty hand leads forth in beauty all the starry band. I think Creator fits there. But traditional hymnody is full of such difficulties. There's a hymn, well, it's not a hymn. Okay, there's an anthem that I would love to use, and for many years I've felt like I couldn't. Tom Glazer wrote something called Because All Men Are Brothers, that is sung to the same tune as O Sacred Head, and it was made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary, so if you're of a certain generation, you might remember that. It's not a hymn, it's a labor anthem, but it's one that I feel I could use in church on the Sunday closest to Labor Day, because it speaks of the universal brotherhood cringe of those who labor. Someone has rewritten it now so that it reads, Because all men are brothers wherever men may be, and women all are sisters, forever proud and free. No tyrant shall defeat us, no nation strike us down, and all who toil shall greet us the whole wide world around. Those new lyrics omit a specific reference to labor unions, which was in the original, but they work pretty well at underscoring what I think is a basic Christian message about universal human solidarity. Now I'd like to share a hymn that breaks barriers by borrowing language. And it's in this same spectrum of gender issues. The hymn is called Mothering God, You Gave Us Birth. It was written by Mennonite poet Jean Jansen in 1991, and it's based on language from Julian of Norwich, who was born in 1343. She was a medieval mystic who's known primarily through her writings for the revelations of divine love. Julian's spirituality moved freely outside the received bounds of the medieval church, but it never really crossed into heresy. And so her address to the divine feminine is useful to us as an orthodox source of something different, as we try to recognize there's not just a divine masculine, there is a divine feminine. And Jean Jansen didn't even want to take credit for writing the English hymn, so she is listed as the alterer of the words by Julian of Norwich. What language shall I borrow? Well, let's borrow some of Julian of Norwich's language. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And now let's talk about you, your favorite hymns, key lines that evoke something deep in you, whether that's a line from a song, secular or religious. One such for me that's semi-secular is the song Anthem by, I'm missing his name right now, which is terrible, but it's what happens to people my age.
Are you thinking of Leonard Cohen?
Leonard Cohen's song Anthem, where he talks about there being a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So that's one of those secular lines that provides language that I borrow from time to time as I reflect on what's going on in my world. I see there are some hands raised, and so Lauren, I'm going to let you sort of moderate the discussion here.
Yeah, absolutely. This is wonderful. I am such a fan of hymns, David. So this was fun, and I do have some questions for you too. But I'm going to start with Leland. Leland, my friend, go ahead and join our conversation here.
Yeah, hi, David. Can you hear me?
Yes, I haven't seen you or heard from you in, how many years? Since 1973 or something, probably? I don't know.
Are you there, Leland?
Yeah, Leland's sound disappeared.
I think Leland muted himself. I've got to unmute you again. There you go, Leland. There you go.
Okay. Can I be heard?
We can hear you.
Huh?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was saying you and I go clear back to 71 when we first met.
Right.
But it's been a lot of years in between. So with those those memories in mind. I'm curious how you would define non music without words. Is there any characterization that would characterize instrumental music, I suppose is the way to say it, as being spiritual or religious?
Well, certainly instrumental music can affect us spiritually. There's no question about that. And depending on the music, that could be a positive or a negative. But certainly within the church's history, you have people disagreeing about that. I'm not sure where you live now, Lee, but do you know any members of non-instrumental churches of Christ?
No, I don't. No,
my grandson married into such a family, and he's a professional musician, so that was a bit of a difficulty for him, but they worked it through, I think. There are a number of factors that come in. One is the creator's intent, the composer's intent. One is the artist's intent, the interpreter's intent. But then there are actual musical forms that tend to have different emotional responses that they draw from us. I'm not ready to list them out right now. A lot of people immediately retreat to saying something like minor keys are sad, but that's just not true. Nevertheless, certain things do produce certain effects. Different tempos, different speeds produce different effects. And the use then to which those are put, yes, instrumental music can have a wonderful spiritual impact, and it can also not be that. Yeah.
Isn't all music cultural?
Not entirely so, but yes, there's a lot of cultural difference. But one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there's some basic physics that underlies tone production. And just as an example, if you take a string and make it taut and you pluck it, you get a particular note. If you cut the string length in half, you get a note that's an octave higher and an octave higher than that. And there are overtone series within those notes that also are part of the physics of music. So that sort of thing is not cultural, but there is so much that is cultural. I met a woman a few years ago when I was at some meetings in South Africa who had spent a number of years working in Kenya with tribes there who she was in a missionary capacity, but her work as an ethnomusicologist was to study the musical forms of the people and then help them create both Christian songs and just generally helpful songs that would fit within their own cultural framework so that they were not just borrowing stuff from Europe and America. And it was fascinating to listen to her talk about the way that she lived into the cultures of the tribes that she worked with and helped them do that. When I was talking about useful songs, for example, she was interested in public health issues. And so she would help them write songs that help them remember, how to observe proper sanitation and how to care for a baby and, those kinds of things, as well as songs about the Christian faith.
Right. I'm not a musician. I'm very, I wasn't born with that gift. Well, obviously you were. But aren't there even scales different, in other
Yes.
parts of the world?
Yes.
They
They're
have
different.
very different musical structure.
That's
I know
that's right. And the Indian music particularly has many more subdivisions in the basic scale than we have. So, we have 7 steps that get us through do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and then we have a few half tones in between. But they have many, many more. But the basic physics of the music is the same.
Right.
Yeah, I have a young friend who decided that as a jazz musician, because jazz calls for shading of pitches in a way that aren't the pitches that you would play on the piano. You approach the pitch just slightly off here, and slightly off there. He studied Carnatic singing, which is a basic Indian approach, and so that he could get his ear tuned to all those extra microtones in between. And just as a side note, Kamala Harris's mother was a prize-winning singer in that particular style of singing.
It isn't the challenge for Christianity somewhat different when it comes to the issue of music than for other of the world's great religions, in that Christianity presents itself as a universal religion and consequently has to be willing to make changes. I think particularly of my own heritage, and that this was brought to my attention during the years that I was living in Greece and working for the Adventist Church in Greece. The Protestant hymn book in Greece is essentially Western, and consequently served to brand the Protestant churches that had strong ties to their Western founders, like Adventism, as something foreign.
Yeah, and not just Adventism. That was all the missionary churches.
That's what I thought I just said that. Yeah, yes. But this is, to me, one of the challenges that faces Christianity, is that this can seem so fundamental in one culture. Obviously all of the music that you played is familiar, having grown up in and around Adventism my entire life. In the American scene, our era, that was all the typical thing. However, the monotonic, and you're probably even more familiar than I am because I'm not a musician, with the medieval Orthodox monks that they used. And I've been to Mount Athos and attended the services there that in these monasteries, and they've preserved these traditional musical forms for 1,000 years.
Yes, I'm a little aware of that, and I actually attended a divine service with Patriarch Bartholomew in his compound there in what we now call Istanbul, but what he still thinks is Constantinople. Right. I think that there are a lot of other hands up, Lee. Maybe we should. Move on.
These questions made me. Is there something in the sound or the origin of a piece that makes it worshipful or not? Made me think of a time when one of my church musicians said, would classical music be okay for an offertory? And I said, well, sure. I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't be. If you want, she had studied classical music, and she had that in her repertoire. And she was, by the way, not really somebody who had married into the church family and not really familiar with our ways. But what she played for the offertory was a Mozart minuet. And I was deeply appreciative that she was willing to play, but I and probably others were aware that it was kind of a little dance tune. And I wondered.
Hey, David danced before the Lord.
Exactly. And you just kind of wonder, there's all these little cultural things going on. Patty.
Yes.
Hi, David. This
Hi,
was
Patty.
really interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot. I was fortunate to grow up in a church where music was a really big thing. And my mother was a member of two ladies trios, and we had music around us all the time. And I'm going to jog your memory a little bit, and I'll forgive you if you don't remember, but this was the San Bernardino Church, and you and Levon apparently were right out of college. And the youth group, I was in academy then, and our little youth group would go over to your apartment on Friday nights.
Wow.
And you were very hospitable and gracious to us. And I remember that, and I appreciate it. I have a comment about a hymn that I've always wondered why it never made it to the Adventist hymnal. And I'm thinking that it is because it mentions the word hell. And the hymn is The Love of God. And it has such beautiful visual imagery. The music is gorgeous. And the message of that song is so beautiful about Jesus and creation. And I just always feel bad that we couldn't get that in the hymnal.
All right. And I, of course, have no idea why it didn't make it into the Adventist hymnal. But hymnal committees do a lot of sorting, a lot of choosing, and some things make it and some don't for a wide variety of reasons. But you speak about how the word hell is in that, and of course the scriptures use the word hell, so that's but it's a matter of definition rather than that being a taboo word. But I would like to say other denominations, deal with that. And I got a Dutch Calvinist hymnal recently, and they had included the hymn. It was one of Fanny Crosby's hymns, anyway, that uses the word rapture. I think is it Blessed Assurance that in the chorus uses the word rapture, and they have a footnote in the hymnal saying this means great ecstatic joy. This does not mean being raptured in a secret rapture. They included the hymn, but they felt they really had to define that.
Till my raptured soul shall find rest beyond the word.
Yes.
Yeah, Patty, thank you for that.
Yes,
David, I'm going to inject a little question here, and I don't know.
Actually, I wanted to say one other thing to Patty.
Go ahead.
Memories of San Bernardino. One of the songs that was very popular at that time, as a popular song, was a biblical song, "Turn, Turn, Turn,"
Yeah.
which has words from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season. And I remember that hearing after the fact that Pastor Jakes and his sons were driving somewhere, and that came on the radio, and he reached over to turn it off, and his boys said, "Wait a minute, we sang that with Pastor Neff. What's wrong with that?"
Good one. David, do you know the origin of why there are so many very military songs in the? I've often wondered about that. If you think about Christian soldiers marching as to war, and that's why stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross.
And Lead On, O King Eternal is another one. There are many like that, and actually there are examples from the early centuries of the church. There's a Latin hymn called Vexilla Regis, which I can't remember what the English lyrics would be, but it suggests that the cross is like a military standard that precedes the troops. Somebody just said, "Soldiers of Christ, arise," on the chat there. Yes, so I think that we have to remember that First of all, there is military language in the scriptures. It's there. You know, Paul tells us to put on the whole armor of God, which is metaphorical, but it's still military language. But beyond that, then you have the fact that church and state for many centuries were so closely aligned, and we can remember the history of the Crusades. So really, I would think it would be surprising if there weren't hymns that had a lot of military language like that. But people have shrunk back from that in more recent years. Those hymns are no longer being included in hymnals.
Yeah, I found myself not choosing them quite as often when I was a pastor, although
Yes,
some church members loved them.
yes, and I can tell you, in a church staff meeting recently, I suggested we use the Battle Hymn of the Republic for a particular service, and one of the clergy said, "Oh no, that's so military," and yet I love the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and yeah. Well, anyway.
Yeah, a lot of our, I understand, a lot of our choices in these things have to do, as you mentioned earlier, with some certain nostalgia. I mentioned the other day that I once expressed that I found the theology of I come to the garden alone not very meaningful, and my congregation rose up against me saying that is my favorite hymn, or it was Mother's favorite hymn. People just loved that hymn. And so I just never said a word about it again, and we sang it.
Yes.
Chris, are you there?
I am. Thank you for this presentation today. It's just really, really good.
I see you're reaching out to us from outer space today.
I've always wanted to be an astronaut, so yeah, I'm doing that background. It's nice to be back here today. I think historians will look back, and I've been a pastor, as many of you know, and part of the worship wars since the Celebration Church came on the scene in Adventism in the 1990s, but also way before that, when Wedgwood Trio was ostracized in the Adventist Church, and the heritage singers were called the heretic singers. And on this battle has gone, and it is, truly cultural, the songs we sing. And I can appreciate Lauren saying, well, there's time to just zip your lip and let people enjoy their song too. And I think there just needs to be more flexibility in the church. But I think the last 30 years or so will be looked back as a day of the greatest change in church singing, with the screen and singing contemporary songs rather than the ancient hymns. And of course, the old guard of the church loves the old hymns, and the young people are saying, wait, there's this new song I just heard on the radio, and let's sing it this Sunday or Sabbath. For me, I always like great lyrics. Oh, the one you were thinking, the one that came to my mind, the word rapture in the song Face to Face. When with rapture I behold him. There's that word rapture there as well. Mm-hmm. There is a line that I like in a Southern gospel song, and I'll recite you the lyrics. I love good crafted lyrics, and the What Language Shall I Borrow title, David was just really nice today to leave that throughout your presentation. Here's this lyric. It's about the time when John the Baptist sent disciples to Jesus. And the man arrives in town, and the chorus has this lyric. It says, I was trying to catch the crippled man. Did he run past this way? He was rushing home to tell everyone what Jesus did today. And the mute man was telling myself and the deaf girl he was leaving to answer God's call. I know it's hard to believe, but if you don't trust me, ask the blind man. He saw it all.
Mm-hmm.
that lyric is a beautiful chorus that is sung 3 times in that song. It was made popular by the Booth Brothers, and you can find them singing it on YouTube. It was a huge Southern gospel hit for them. So that brings into my mind all the Southern gospel songs and the black spirituals and the white spirituals and the old hymns from the 1800s. We have such a huge library to choose from to help the people sing God's songs. And I think the more, the merrier, and help people sing the old songs as well as sing unto the Lord new songs.
Thank you, Chris. I feel fortunate right now that the little church that I'm part of is very, very diverse. About 1/3 of the people are people of African descent. And that makes me feel like I'm duty bound to blend the use of multiple traditions in our worship. At the same time, I always shrink back from anything that might be cultural appropriation, but that's a whole different discussion. So I'll not deal with that.
That's a very difficult line to find, isn't it, David? I was thinking
Yes.
when I was young, if somebody in our church did a song that had too big of a beat, too much of a beat, people would object. But if they heard some African singing, they would say, "Oh, those people, they have beautiful music."
Yes.
And there's this kind of thing like, they can do it, we shouldn't do it. They somehow were expressing something about God in it that we probably couldn't get away with. Miriam and Leslie, I don't know who's going to be doing the talking here, but
is Leslie. Yes, I would like to raise a question and an observation. I'm a trained musician and organist, and I live here in Wales, and I'm often confronted with the same hymns over and over again, which people sing, rather than the diversity in the Adventist hymnal from the 16th and 17th century. We have Lutheran hymns, we have many hymns, for example, Lord enthroned in heavenly splendor. We very rarely sing it, and the people don't know it. So my question is, even though I play it as a postlude or prelude, how can I get the people to learn other hymns?
Well, that's an interesting question. The first thing, of course, to observe is that the Welsh people have a wonderful set of hymns in their own language, which is just tremendous. In terms of teaching new music, I think you really need to give the background for the music, the reason we're singing this today, and so forth. Rehearse the people on a single verse, maybe before the service starts. There's all sorts of things like that should be done in order to make it comfortable for them to find their way into the new music. But yes,
they keep singing "Burdens are lifted at Calvary" and all the ones, in Christ alone, over and over and over again.
Yes.
Yes. And they're not really exploring the musicality and the tone and the harmony of the other hymn.
Right. Correct.
Thank you.
And may I just join in here that my favourite hymn is "We Have This Hope That Burns Within Our Hearts." I think that's a fantastic hymn, and we don't sing it perhaps enough.
No.
But the church that we go to, it actually, although it's in Wales, it's multicultural.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And that's a fairly new hymn that was written by Wayne Hooper, I think, wasn't it, David?
Yes, it was.
It burns within our hearts, and a lot of people really love it.
I just want to give a tip of the hat to a great Welsh hymnologist who back in the 1920s, a man named David Evans, can't get a more Welsh name than that, he was the one who joined two Irish things together to give us, I just blanked out. Sorry about that. But what's often thought of as an Irish hymn was actually created by a great Welsh hymnologist. Be thou my vision. The text existed, the tune existed, but it was in the 1920s that David Evans said, these two things belong together. And that's when they took off.
Let's see. Sherry Ann, welcome. How are you? I haven't talked to you for a long time. Are you and family doing well?
Hi, Lauren. Yes, we're doing well. And I must say, this afternoon's presentation was refreshing. It's good to hear about music and some of the things that we don't often think about. To your question about favorite hymns, I don't think I have a favorite, but one that comes to mind that I enjoy, which gives a good pretext to my question, is Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. Though I find that I prefer the version in the Sister Act 2 movie. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that version. A bit of a Black American retake on that classical hymn. But that brings me to my question, because I led music in my church for several years, and we would often have a challenge with praise and worship because there are some members of the church who want only the standard, the hymns in the Adventist hymnal. And so if you try to sing anything contemporary, oftentimes you get a pushback. There are some persons who had challenges with drums as a part of the worship service and things like that. And oftentimes you would hear evil and evil intent being ascribed to the music behind some of the songs. And I'd like to get your take on that.
Well, I am very positive about the use of rhythm instruments, strong rhythms in our singing together. I recently read a master's thesis about what it is that makes songs singable by groups. And a strong sense of the rhythm is one of those things. And so if the drums help with that, that's great. Yes, I just don't have any particular criticism of the use of rhythm instruments.
Okay,
in
about
worship.
the contemporary songs, and some of the styles are suggested that they're so emotive that you don't actually hear the words, and so therefore, you shouldn't sing them. I don't know.
As if our classic gospel songs weren't extremely emotionally engaging also. I think we're dealing with the same question there.
Okay, so it's more stylistic preferences than anything else.
Well, and it's not just a matter of stylistic preferences. It is, what is the language of the people? Now, I have to say that a lot of contemporary worship music does not appeal to me.
That's fine. There's a lot that doesn't appeal to me either.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I love to program a lot of variety into our church music, and I think I just lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. But the contemporary worship music is both strong and weak in various ways. The traditional strophic hymn is very easy for people to follow. It tends to put the accents on the natural places where these things fall, or the language would fall. If you start examining a Chris Tomlin song, for example, you'll find that the accents shift all over the place, which makes it difficult for congregational singing. And what we're talking about today is the congregational song, as opposed to this song of musical artists who might serve the Lord perfectly well in other ways. But if it isn't simple enough for everybody to participate in, then it's defeating that basic purpose that Martin Luther articulated right in the beginning of Protestant hymnody.
Okay, agreed. Okay.
But
Yeah, I think sometimes my challenge is even when these songs actually are simple melodies, then there is still pushback because it's not in the hymnal.
Right. Okay, I think we've got some more comments and some more questions, but
it does seem to me, Cherry Ann, that a lot of our decisions about music probably are not musical decisions. They're cultural and preference decisions.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, but let me go back to what I just.
And pastors, we have struggled with that. How do you bring together a whole congregation of 500 people singing together? Somebody is going to hate it. You just have to accept that.
Yeah. Let me go back to what we were just saying, though, about it needing to be in the musical language of the people, whatever that is culturally at a given time and place. I have a person in my congregation who is from Namibia. She was a freedom fighter there, and she came to America as a refugee. And just as people need to pray in their own language, they often need to sing in their own language. And she came to our church because when she was in another church here in Baltimore, she would be singing in her native language, which is Oshiwambo. And she came up to me recently because that other church, the pastor just said, "You will not sing in Oshiwambo. Everything has to be in English." Well, we have a number of African immigrants in our congregation. And when she told me that story, I said, "I want you to sing. Sing in English and then sing the same verse in Oshiwambo for us." And just the fact of her being able to sing in her own language was extremely important to her, but also to the many other African immigrants whose first language wasn't Oshiwambo. They were from various parts of Africa. But it meant something to them to hear someone sing in a native language. And I think that's very important. We need to make room for that.
But was it a traditional Christian hymn sung in a different language?
Yes, yes. The first time she sang for us, it was "Lord, I Want to Be a Christian," but sung in Oshiwambo. And the second time she sang for us, it was "Standing on the Promises," but in Oshiwambo.
Interesting. I was interested when I visited India, Raj Adikan, how that most of the music that was sung there was done with people were singing in Tamil, but they were hymns that I knew that I could sing along with. A few hymns I think that probably I didn't know, and I didn't know whether they were hymns from somewhere else or whether they were traditional or they were specific Tamil hymns. I wasn't sure, but it was interesting.
Yeah, I had a similar experience of it when I visited China and went to church there. The first song I heard was "Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior."
In Chinese.
In Chinese, that's right. But I have a friend, an acquaintance from Pakistan who has tried to make something good out of what the Presbyterian missionaries did when they translated the Psalms into Urdu. That was wonderful. But the music they used just didn't go with the local population. So the language was perfect. The music was not. And so he has spent years and years adapting those texts to specifically Pakistani native music. And it's just wonderful to see what Eric is doing.
That's lovely. Hey, Emmanuel, my friend, join the conversation here.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Beautiful presentation. My question is in two parts. What makes for you an acceptable hymn? The lyric or the word of the music. And the second part is, if it's not a violin, if it's not a piano, if it's something else, we cannot sing in the church. Your song is not acceptable. To be acceptable, we have to have a violin or a piano. If it's something else,
Well,
David, do you remember the Guitar Wars?
oh, of course I do. Of course I do. And first, let's talk about what makes an acceptable hymn. The key factor, I think, is what are the words? What are they saying? What are they teaching? How are they forming us? What are they helping us express? That's key. That's important. But the second thing, in terms of musical form, that I think needs to be culturally appropriate to the setting. Now, I would hope that people are broadly experienced in music enough to enjoy and participate in music of a number of different styles. But I know that's not always the case, and that needs to be worked with. I would say there's also a step difference between what makes an acceptable hymn, which is a congregational thing, and what makes an acceptable piece of music that can fit into a worship service. I've used a couple of songs that come out of Broadway, essentially. And I consulted with my pastor on these, and his response was, how is it different from me quoting a secular poet about something that we all think is a good ideal? And so we've kind of gone with that. So if you know Les Mis, I did have a soloist sing Bring Him Home, which is a prayer for the safety of a young person who's going to be facing battle. There's nothing wrong with that sentiment. It's something that we would all pray for, the safety of the young people who are in that position. But we had one or two congregation members who objected just because it came out of a Broadway play. Similarly, City of Man from the film version of Godspell has a lot of ideals that are very much in line with our Christian faith, even though the lyrics say, not a city of God, but a city of man. But it's about building up those ideals in our own work in society. So I've kind of figured that the pastor's guidance, if it is a song that serves something that we trust and believe in, a noble ideal, then it's the same as just quoting that poet in the pulpit.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Appreciate that. David, the rest of you, Emmanuel's question made me think of a piece that we have that Jen Cohen wrote for Adventist Today called That Devilish Church Music. And she points out in there that all of the instruments that we now consider truly churchy, like the pipe organ, were once considered secular and awful. She said Luther himself called the organ the ensign of Baal. And Thomas Aquinas and others thought that the violin was a terrible instrument to be used in music because it was by its nature secular. And the same for the piano. The piano was considered something for dances and such. And she says, this is really cute. She says there's only one instrument that's unequivocally recommended in the Old Testament that nobody can argue with, and that is the drum. So I posted the link here, and I think you'll enjoy it. Karen Kotowski, it's your turn.
Unmute, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, the hymns have meant everything throughout my life. I haven't gone to church in decades, except for go to mass or when with my husband. And I wanted to say how much hymns have meant to me, the Adventist hymns that are deep in my heart, in my soul. I sing them. I wake up in the morning and sing them, and they mean everything in the world to me. And I think I Come to the Garden Alone is my favorite. But my comment today really is, in all the times that I've gone to Catholic Mass with my husband, Tom, or visited cathedrals around the world, I was in Lisbon and at Mass last week, there's something hugely missing, but only a Protestant who loves Protestant would notice what's missing. And Catholics, they might have some organ music, but they don't really have joyful song or hymns of praise like Protestants have. And we have such a rich culture and history and gift in music that we have in our churches. And I did want to make one comment that the Unitarians have done a beautiful job of degendering hymns. Their hymns have basically, I haven't recognized any gender in there at all. They've done a beautiful job of it.
Very good. I would say there was a book maybe 20 years ago now called Why Catholics Can't Sing, which was full of great humor, actually, but tapping into a reality. This is not to say that there isn't great Catholic music. Mozart's Requiem is great Catholic music. But it's still, there is not the same strong tradition of asking the people to sing and making the people the center of things. That is a very Protestant thing. With the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church caught onto that theological concept, but it's been very difficult for that to kind of play out in the churches to the same extent that it has played out in Protestantism. But they understand now. I've got lots of Catholic friends who will say the church is the people. They get that point, but it just hasn't blossomed in the same way.
As I recall, Thomas Day blamed the Irish that Catholics can't sing.
Yes,
I remember read that book years ago. Karen, did you want to follow up on that?
I wanted to say I did drop into a mass in the main cathedral in Guadalajara, Mexico, and there was a group of charismatic Catholics singing and actually waving their hands and singing hymns, and it was beautiful. It was fun to see that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I had a similar experience, Karen. I dropped into a Catholic cathedral in Chennai in India and walked in, and they were singing gospel songs. And I was like shocked. I didn't realize it could be done.
Yes.
Lynn, are you there?
Well,
Try again. Try again, Lynn.
You're muted, Lynn.
Am I there now?
You
Yes.
are here now, Lynn.
Okay, so many things to say in short little time. First of all, David, I want to thank both you and your wife, Lavon, for being a part of my my musical experience and for your ministry throughout these years, even when we have not been in contact with each other. Thank you. And you might remember some of the things that you did when we were, closer. You actually were a part of some of the musical performances that I was involved with. So it brings back lots of memories just to see you here. Thanks. I want to reinforce what you said about both the words, the theological importance of the words for a good hymn, and also the fact that they are accessible to the congregation, which is what you've been emphasizing throughout. I appreciate that. Let me give you some practical examples from my life. I spent a good share of my career in Africa. Some of you know this. And I was fascinated by the music, first of all, when I was at Heidelberg College. I was there during the 90s when the college itself was trying to integrate the union was integrated, so the college as a union institution had to integrate. The conferences were not integrating where we were locally, but the coloreds and the indigenous blacks were coming to school more. We were trying to get more professors who were involved who were different race and different cultures, and the students themselves who were coming did not feel comfortable in the college church, which was dominated by the Dutch,
Yes.
English religions. People who had come from that. They were Seventh-day Adventists, but they were like, I remember the first Sabbath I was there, we sang "Oh Happy Day," and I looked around, there was not a smile in the whole congregation. So I was, I was not surprised that the people who were more demonstrative in their worship were not very comfortable in the church. So they asked the college for another venue, and they got that venue, and they started having their worship services there. And I noticed a difference in the music, particularly that especially in the black communities, they did not have a strong tradition of using instruments. Instead, they were very creative in just singing. So the songs, they most of them did not read music the way that we read music, but they heard harmonies. They were able to harmonize very well, and so they would start in whatever key, and then they would improvise. A lot of them didn't have hymn books. The words were sometimes different. Certainly the rhythms were different, but what happened was a very creative experience. And every time we sang a song, it was different. It was never the same. I remember going to a township in near Cape Town, a black church. One of my students invited me there, and I was astounded by how the songs would just, they would have a leader who would come out, but often the songs would just start from, within the congregation itself spontaneously. And people say, "Oh yeah, I know that one," and they'd all join in, and then they would have different variations on the theme, very much like a professional musician. They would add little things that they felt were important. I have a lot of other things to say about that, but I can remember also thinking, why are we singing songs of old white men when these people, it doesn't really fit with them? And these are dead white men. I mean, old songs. And so I found out that they had their own songs, that they were not often free to sing them in church. But when they did sing them, they, if you get away from the more established main cities, you hear more of these other songs, and
Right.
they were really creative. So essentially, I came to the conclusion that music and the worship experience is a lot more emotional, especially with music, and mystical than we are comfortable with traditionally as Seventh-day Adventists. And anything that raises those emotions and feelings of awe, and that we didn't understand, things that were not rational, a little bit less rational, we didn't quite catch on, that made us uncomfortable. And we find that more in the indigenous music than I find in the established music in our hymns. But what was necessary is that everybody could sing them. They were accessible to everybody. And then we had this this feeling of community, this fellowship that was so strong. I never felt it as much as I felt it in Africa, or when I felt it in a song service that people sang with. And one of the big questions I have now is, what does the future hold for this in not just in SDA churches, but in Christianity generally? When I go to church, the people up in front seem to be more performers than they are part of the community. And that to me is a huge loss. I recently tried to get my congregation to sing a song that I learned in South Africa that I really liked, and I thought it was accessible. I just posted it for anybody who wants to go to YouTube and listen to it. called "We Are Marching Over to Jerusalem." We are marching over. You may have heard this. Some of you. To me, it's an easy song to learn, and everybody gets into this. It's just like we are together. We are doing something. We are going somewhere. What more can you ask for in a Christian fellowship? Just my comments, and thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Lynn. South African music can be really, really special. I've heard the Soweto Gospel Choir in concert. Absolutely fabulous singing, and a lot of that, what should I say? A lot of that improvisation that's within the genre is just wonderful. And another song from the region that I actually have used in church here, because I do have African immigrant and African refugee members in my church. We sing Nkosi Sikelele Afrika from time to time. But I'm reminded.
The way Lynn was at Walla Walla College at the same time I was, so we have lots of common friends and experiences, including knowing David and Levon and Neff.
Yes, I just want to say one more thing to Lynn, if I could. Well, I'm sorry, I just derailed mentally. Sorry about that. But it might come back. But it related to South Africa. So,
Lynn raises a really good question, and I suspect there are several others of us here who probably related to that. I'm a person that's uncomfortable with being too moved by music, and I suspect there are probably some of the others of you who have similar experiences. I don't quite trust emotions. That's maybe an Adventist thing, but we'll talk about that a little bit after we talk to Gina. Gina Jett. Gina was one of my church members, David, back in Palo Alto.
Palo Alto, wonderful.
Long time ago. I wanted to tell you about a hymn that I became familiar with about 10 years ago, and it may be something you call an anthem. I learned it at the Methodist church. They have a traditional hymnal, and they also have a book that the pianist used to refer to as campfire songs. And it's from the Campfire Songbook. And it's called Who is My Mother, Who is My Brother? And it's written by a woman named Shirley Arena Murray. She's from New Zealand and wrote this song in 1992. And the first verse says, who is my mother, who is my brother? All those who gather around Jesus Christ. Spirit-blown people born from the gospel sit at the table around Jesus Christ. And the second verse is particularly meaningful to me because I learned this song about the time my son came out as a transgender person. And so it had a lot of meaning for me. And it says, differently abled, differently labeled, widen the circle around Jesus Christ. Crutches and stigmas, culture's enigmas all come together around Jesus Christ. Love will relate us, color or status can't segregate us around Jesus Christ. Family failings, human railings, all are accepted around Jesus Christ. And then there's a final verse, but I think that's so powerful. And I'm going to post the lyrics in the chat if anybody's interested. You can also hear the tune of it on YouTube. I've had different songs in my heart from my upbringing. One of them, I've always had trouble sleeping when I was working, and I used to like the song, Be Still My Soul, the Lord is on your side. That would just kind of help me go to sleep. And I know when I was working as an attorney, working with people, I felt oftentimes it was my job to give them a voice when they were unable to do it. And I used to like the anthem called Make Me a Servant. And those are just songs that have resonated with me through the years. I appreciate your presentation today.
Well, thank you. I'm going to look up Who is My Mother, Who is My Brother. I think that that would appeal to me. Two hymns that are very inclusive that I use from time to time. One is a song called All Are Welcome, written by Marty Haugen, who has written a lot of contemporary music for congregations. And in addition to All Are Welcome, another one called Gather Us In. Those are two hymns that are very focused on announcing at the beginning of worship that this is an inclusive place where everybody is welcome.
Powerful.
And who is my mother, who is my brother? We recognize where that language comes from, right?
Yes.
It's Jesus pointing out that it's his followers, not his blood relatives.
They're his people.
Yes.
Several people are asking you to post that link, so please do that.
Lauren, I need to step away just to get a drink of water, but I'll be right back.
Not a problem. I just wanted to mention to all of you that.
Sorry, I thought I was out of water and had what I needed.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, let's have Linda join the conversation. And let me unmute you, Linda.
David, it's good to
Yes.
see you.
Good to see you, Linda.
I should say, I'm still in Jacksonville. If you come back again, we must have a coffee again.
Okay. Yes.
Do you remember, David, do you remember at La Sierra, and I forget his name, Professor, whatever, who was either the organist and or the director of music at La Sierra Church, would not permit couples who were being married there to use their traditional Wagner wedding march, nor the bridal chorus either, I guess, because of the opera from which they came, considered to be pagan music. It just struck me, I'd forgotten that, a memory from the past. I was interested, as Lynn was, that you said that lyrics would probably be the most significant thing to you. I can appreciate that. I think, however, you might have changed your view if you had been present in the church that I attend when the young man who was on the piano accompanying congregational singing and apparently doesn't read music and was of the belief that all three of the chords in the first measure of holy, holy, holy are all the same. It's like fingernails on a blackboard.
Yes.
But my question really is centered upon that. I do have a question for you. And that is I'm not a historian in this field as you are, but I'm a little curious over the past, 2 or 3 years, how would you say that lyrics, the words, the hymns, have shaped the doctrine?
Okay, I think there was a glitch in the internet and I missed part of what Linda said.
Linda, could you repeat that last question again?
I think she's frozen.
What she asked
have the words of hymns
shaped doctrines?
Oh, how they changed doctrines? Folks, I work in 2 very liberal mainline denominations now, so nobody even thinks about doctrine where I work. That is the Episcopal Church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But I don't think that hymn lyrics are going to necessarily change doctrine, but they can soften the people of God to certain kinds of prophetic concerns. And so the sort of hymn that we were just talking about, who is my mother, who is my brother, which raises questions of inclusion, if you sing enough of the songs that emphasize inclusion, it may not change doctrine, but it will change the dynamic in a congregation.
But I'm thinking more doctrine. I co-teach an adult Bible study class, and I'm telling you, it is so hard to move people away from the idea of works, even though they can say the words and cognitively They believe in righteousness by faith, but I feel like there's a sense in which the hymns we all grew up singing, you know, trust and obey, and I'll go where you want me to go, have thine own way, where he leads me, I will follow, that whether it may not have changed doctrine, but it somehow solidifies a thought process in a certain orientation.
It does indeed. And so, you know, I would just recommend singing more of those good old grace hymns. And
Well,
not
in
that,
any
not
event,
that, but not that I think obedience is a bad thing either. You know, I mean, there's a place for all of those. But what's necessary is that whoever is guiding the congregation, the pastor and the worship leader, and so on and so forth, need to make sure that those things like obedience and grace are not held in tension, but are seen in their proper dynamic relationship.
I can see that. I can see
Yes.
how that would be true.
But if
But
all
and
you if all you sing is trust and obey, for there's no other way, then that is a problem.
Right. Well, that's kind of, you know, in the old days, you know, I think it's probably a non-issue, as you say, anymore, particularly with contemporary music. It's less applicable. But in any event, I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate your presentation, and you must give Levon my best.
I will do that.
Linda, one of the things that strikes me that probably has been changed, at least I've often thought about this. Think of how many hymns that we use as sort of, we have become sort of evangelical, probably always were, to the extent that we emphasize sin a lot. And think of how many hymns that we used and sang that talked about how very sinful we are and how we have to fall at the foot of the cross, and the blood, and the fountain filled with blood, and the blood of Jesus. And it strikes me that quite reinforced that notion of we're very sinful and we have to be constantly revived and reconverted. And this bothers me a little bit, because it does seem to me that we also at the same time expected people to make progress, and yet by means of these hymns, we are always calling them back to say that they were terrible sinners and needed to be reconverted again.
Exactly.
So it was
exactly.
Sort of there was sort of I preached about this at Glendale a couple of weeks ago. There's sort of a battle between making progress and affirming that we're making progress, and at the same time, oh, you are so sinful and you have to be revived and reborn, and you have to come to the foot of the cross again. So we were kind of halfway between those two things. And I told about how some years ago I had a church member in Palo Alto who, after I preached a gospel sermon, came out and said, I am so sick of being told how sinful I am. I'm not that bad. At the time, I was kind of shocked, and then I got to thinking about it, that really, in a sense, I was giving her two different messages. I was saying, do better, and you should be making progress through life. At the same time, I was telling her, oh, you were so sinful, repent again. And so I've been thinking about that. To me, the hymns contributed a lot to that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, and those hymns come out of the revivalist tradition. And so the people who generated them were people like Ira D. Sankey, who was traveling from place to place, trying to spark revival. But when that happens, in a way that it makes the local congregation freeze in revival mode, as opposed to the sort of the healthy the healthy living of the truth, that's a problem.
And people, a lot of Adventists, a lot of people want that. I remember some of my church members who came to me and said, why don't you have a call after the end of every sermon? I said, because I don't really see the need to tell you to repent every week. And that was a bit of a struggle for me, because in their tradition, that was the typical thing. Every week, they were from another culture. Every week, the pastor got up and said, do you want to come up again today and repent your sins? I did begin to do calls, but I did them a little different. I said, would you like to come up and have me pray, kneel with me and have me pray for the things that are troubling you in your life? And that worked okay for me, but it is interesting. I think our hymns shaped that revival tradition a lot. Michael Schofield, I'm going to ask you to unmute and join the conversation.
Yes, David, thank you for your presentation, very well researched. But I disagree with you that,
well,
Linda
you're just wrong, Michael.
David and I sat next to each other in freshman physics class.
And not only that, we taught physics labs at opposite ends of a hallway.
That is correct. Yes.
And when we interfered with each other's teaching.
Yeah, I forgot about that. But there is every individual has their own theology and their own belief system, and it may vary considerably from declared and voted doctrine at the top of any denomination. And there's a lot of bad theology in the lyrics of hymns. And that's a major problem. That saved a wretch like me. I remember a sermon in the Army where we are not wretches. Are you ready for Jesus to come? Have you been faithful in all that you do? As if you're not ready, those lyrics are a denial of grace.
Mm-hmm.
But
so that's
a problem.
Yes, that saved a wretch like me is not a denial of grace. It's a celebration of grace. That's what John Newton, former slaver, was just amazed at grace that brought him back.
Yeah, and that's a useful background, but there still is a lot of bad theology in some of the lyrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt about there being a lot of bad theology in hymn lyrics. Theoretically, that's what hymnal committees that put together these things are supposed to be examining, and that it's going to vary from denomination to denomination. And in a sense, a lot of our music has broken free of the hymnal tradition. Just from a sheer economic standpoint, printing hymnals is a very expensive proposition, which is one reason that projected screens, reprinting things in bulletins has taken over, and why we have several licensing organizations that allow us to follow copyright rules when we do that.
Thank you.
Michael, I love that you mentioned, are you ready for Jesus to come? I find some of the theology in there just dreadful. And it's funny that I heard somebody do and this leads into my question for you, David, and that I mentioned before, and that has to do with the emotions in music and how it affects us. I heard somebody sing it the other day, and it was a beautiful arrangement with a beautiful voice. And I started walking around the house saying, are you ready for Jesus to come? Are you faithful in all that you do? And my wife said, why are you singing that hymn? I said, because it's so pretty. She said, that you don't like that theology for Jesus to come by becoming perfect and faithful. And I said, that's true. And it bothers me. And it makes me realize that music can be a rather insidious way into our minds if you're not careful. Our parents told us that when we were listening to rock and roll when we were young. And I remember telling them, I don't listen to the words, but I did. We always, to me, and I'll tell you this, I don't know about Michael, but for me, I'm very I'm very cerebral in the way I'm very cognitive in the way I process things, and I actually don't like to be emotionally manipulated in any way. It bothers me a great deal. If I find myself listening to a song and giving theory about it. Any of the rest of you out there who are like that and would feel the same way. And so I really struggle. I actually struggle with listening to music sometimes, David, because I don't like the feeling that it kind of goes in underneath my cognitive processing of it. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. It does. And yet there, I have to say there's got to be a place in our lives where that emotional power of music can be a healing force for us when properly used. I remember some of my earliest experience with revivalism as an organist. I was a teenager, played the organ at the Adventist church in Tucson, Arizona. And, a particular revivalist came to town that we were going to be supporting, and he needed some help with the organ. And he took me aside before the service and he said, "Now, when you see me do this," and he put his hand behind his back and wiggled his fingers. He said, "When you see me do that, that's when I want you to start playing softly." And I began to sort of see from inside the sort of way in which those meetings were produced, how that manipulation was happening. And then, of course, I was attending meetings with the ushers who were going to be there, and he would say, "Now, when I do this, I want you all to just kind of go out into the aisles and look for people who are a little distressed and step up to them and take them by the elbow and say, 'Would you like me to walk forward with you?'" So in some ways, there's good aspects to that, but I became very suspicious of the manipulation that was going on in that kind of a setting, because I knew that evangelist had specific goals of getting a certain number of people across the finish line, rather than just kind of relying on the Holy Spirit to do what the Holy Spirit does.
Oh yes, well, every head is bowed and every eye is closed. Let me just tell you, the worst of all were, I don't know if any of you still remember the Barron brothers, but I remember Dick Barron standing up in front and just droning on and on with the choir singing, "I Surrender All," and saying, "Just last night, a lady called me and said her husband, who I begged to come forward, died during the night. And don't let that happen to you."
Yeah.
At that point, I remember processing that and thinking, this is all so wrong. This is so manipulative. I will never do this in my life. And I never did.
Good for you, Lauren.
I have also bragged to this group, David, that I never preached a sermon about the perils and persecutions at the time of the end. And I somehow made it through Adventist ministry for 42 years. I don't know about Chris Widmer. I suspect he probably was pretty much an altar call guy. What do you think, Chris?
I've made a few altar calls, but not with Just As I Am. And when you mentioned Dick Barron, I was baptized at the end of one of Dick Barron and Ray Turner's series at the La Sierra Church, 1972. As I've mentioned here before, I was baptized by Morris Venden, so you can't get any more holy than that. So I think music, Lauren, is God's attempt to break through your and my Germanic cerebral heritage. I think it reminds me of the hymn that we praise thee with our minds. I don't think I've ever sung it, but I think that would be the Germanic hymn. For me, I thought I would mention two things. One is, after our firstborn child came out as transgender, Debbie and I would be in church, and it was often the hymns about grace that caused my wife and I to look at each other with tears rolling down our faces. She was in queue number 2, and I was there on the platform, as preachers usually sit on the platform, at least they did in those days. And we knew that the words we were singing about were not the words that the church would live to us and has not lived to us when they found out we were now part of the LGBT affirming community as parents. And that relates to my second comment of the Southern gospel music again. We've gone to a couple Southern gospel music conventions here in California the last 2 years. And I've written 2 very lengthy letters to write to one of the artists that sing about songs about grace. And this comes back to what we were talking earlier. How does music influence doctrine? I'm more interested in how does music influence behavior? How does it influence the ethos of a church? And as David mentioned, if you sing inclusive songs, then maybe there will be a greater ethos of inclusiveness. The song, "In Christ there is no east or west, in him no north or south." Well, we've sung that song for years. We ought to write a verse that says, "In him there is no Jew or Greek, in him no male nor female." And maybe that would influence our church a little bit in the direction of women's ordination. I don't know. There seems to be a disconnect between the words of grace and inclusivity we sing and still the walls that we as church people build up to separate ourselves from into the 2 groups of the holy people who are ready for Jesus to come. See, the person who sings, "Are you ready for Jesus to come?" is singing that from a standpoint of they're ready, he's ready, she's ready. But are you? Have you joined me in being ready? Because if you're not, eating the foods I'm eating and wearing the things I'm wearing, then you're not ready for Jesus to come. You have to be like me to be ready. I think there's just a disconnect between the words of grace and the living out of that grace in Christianity. At least
that's a good point.
That's where I've been at. Loved your sermon at Glendale, by the way, Lauren. I watched all of it. Thank you for those words.
Yeah, I just want to chime in and say, because of my years of experience with revivalism, as a arranger and composer, I finally wrote a new tune for "Just As I Am." The words are actually pretty good words, but the tune we sing it to is one of those tunes that makes you want to crawl up the aisle rather than walk up the aisle with head erect. And so and since I belong to a denomination where we have communion and go to the altar every single week, it's that kind of an altar call. So I just felt the need to write some different music that would allow people to sing those excellent words, but with the right kind of feeling. That, if indeed grace is what it is and you are that accepted, then walk straight. Stand up.
David and Chris, it does occur to me that we didn't, none of us grew up in a setting in which going up and receiving the magic bread and the magic juice really represented a whole lot. In Adventist theology, it's just merely a symbol and really something you have to do. David, I remember going to church with you and Levon in Wheaton or wherever it was back there, and I had been in an evangelistic training school, and I remember the day when I went to church with you and went up and got the bread and the wine, and I burst into tears, because you know what the difference was, David? There was nothing being asked of me. I was receiving it absolutely freely. Mm-hmm. There was nobody standing there and saying, "Are you a vegetarian? Are you straight or gay?" I was just walking up there and getting it. There was no belief, and so I love that idea that you just mentioned of that coming to the altar. I still don't understand the theology of transubstantiation. I'm not sure it makes any sense to me.
And that's not. There are many theologies of of what happens in communion that still emphasize sort of the real connection with Christ that happens at that time, whether that's phrased in medieval philosophy like transubstantiation is, or in other ways. But if it is a point of connection, it's a point of connection with Jesus' presence.
I want to get Ed Zerkwitz in here before we're out of time, Chris. Ed, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, and thank you, Lauren and David, of course, for your presentation. I remember seeing studies done of where they had plants in a room, or separate rooms maybe, and they'd play rock music, and then in a separate room they'd have classical music. You know, it's like Mozart or something like that. I can't remember the musicians, but under the rock music, the plants didn't do so well, and then under the more classical music, plants grew about, in this particular study, I remember, twice as fast and looked twice as good or whatever. But there are actual studies that's even exposing water structure to different kinds of music. You'll see erratic, chaotic looking water crystals and stuff under the microscope, or under certain music you'll see very structured and you know, attractive, I guess, water crystals. And so music has a definite effect on the body, on physical things. And so if you translate that into a church setting, or a religious setting, if you like, you know, that's going to have certain effects. But I was thinking more in terms of the effects of, you know, to your health, for example, or to the way your brain is working and so forth. Do you have any comments on
that? I don't have a lot to say there. I do recognize that music has both physical and psychological effects on human beings. I don't know about plants. That's, you know, that's just, I'm not a plant, I'm sorry. But I think that wise use of music for good purposes, for good intentions, is what we need to be doing, rather than staying away from it. And I would want to say, I think that lively rock music depends on, you know, its effect on people is going to be what it is, not what genre it is. The same is true of classical music. I mean, that is such a broad category that it's just awfully hard to even know what to do with it.
Chris Widmer said, "My plants die no matter what music I play." So there's that.
Yes,
I think that's probably true for some of us. And let me just we've got to finish up here, and I just wanted to say to all of you, I hope all of you who attend here have been able to get our latest magazine, the one that's called "What I Love, Appreciate, and Proud of About My Church." I think a lot of people have really enjoyed it. We're trying to, in Adventist today, really build up the culture and the world that we in. Chris said it's a great issue, and I've heard a lot of people tell me that. I will just finish up, David, first of all, by thanking you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I wanted to get my friend Raj Adikan in here to mention this, but a while back in one of his presentations when he taught here, he was talking about taking the gospel to the world and to other religions. And he grew up in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. And he said that one of the hymns that he remembers singing, and imagine this, you're a Sri Lankan child growing up singing English hymns. And one of them was called From Greenland's Icy Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And the words were, what though the spicy breezes blow soft on Ceylon's isle, though every prospect pleases, and only man is vile.
Bad hymn.
Yeah, bad theology right there. Not a really good missionary hymn, and it has fallen into disuse. Those of you, the magazine has been mailed, Angie. Those of you who haven't gotten it yet, sometimes it takes a while, but write to me or write to Annette at atoday.org, atoday@atoday.org, and ask Annette where your magazine is. And sometimes, as in David Levon's case, they had moved to a different home, and so they're not getting their magazine anymore. And I did change that address, and that may be true of some of you. We want you to keep getting the magazine, and we want you to keep getting our fundraising letters. Folks, we are doing really, really well. Our reach right now in Adventist Today, our ministry, and we call this a ministry. We are not just ragging on our church, or we're trying to introduce people to a more profound and thoughtful spirituality. And if you're not getting your magazine, atoday at atoday.org, and just say, Annette, I'm typing it right here, atoday at atoday.org. Just say, Annette, my magazine hasn't come. If she can't get it to you in the mail, she'll make sure she'll email you a PDF version of it, which I think she did to David.
Yes, I got the PDF. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. This was wonderful. And I don't see Levon here anymore, but I'm sure she's listening in. And thank you both for the wonderful ministry you've done, and for me particularly, how you ministered to me through the years. And we will end this meeting and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.